as you can see up there on the board, I have listed global warming asking the wrong question. And I want you to keep that in the back of your head now, because it really sums up my whole argument, and I'll come back to it later. Now, debates surrounding global warming have been around since we were all born, and they certainly aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And today, I'd like to present a different way of thinking about the scientific evidence presented around global warming that will hopefully prove that even if you think that it's a hoax, it's still a good idea to push for policy change. So I hope you're ready to think outside the box so you can follow along with this here. Now, I've done research to figure out exactly what it is science tells us that global warming is. And actually, last semester, I had a class on the philosophy of science, which will prove rather useful towards the end of the speech. Now, I'm going to begin by talking about exactly what it is science tells us global warming is. Then I'm going to talk about a report published by the IPCC back in October. And then I'm going to talk about how we should think about all this information, basically, a new way to think about it than you might be used to. So let's begin by talking about what global warming is. So, ever since humans have started to do activities such as burning coal or perhaps acts of deforestation, we've increased the abundance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because of the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is a property of these so-called greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide. It's actually rather simple to understand. These gases act as a sort of blanket for our planet, that the sun emits heat, and then these gases trap some of that heat and insulate it in our atmosphere. Now, if the greenhouse gases didn't exist, all of the heat would basically escape into space, and the planet would freeze over and probably be uninhabitable. So really, we owe our existence almost to these gases. But yet, the issue with global warming is that as we increase the amount or the abundance of these gases in the atmosphere, the insulation becomes more intense, the blanket becomes thicker, and the global temperatures rise. And as far as we understand it, the climates on Earth are very, very sensitive, and even a slight increase of temperature could prove to be disastrous. Now, in a scholarly journal I researched published in 2006, they looked at different trends throughout the years in the mean temperatures, and they found that there was a 0.0 degrees Celsius increase in yearly mean temperatures from the years of 1880 to 2000. And it's a rather linear fit. It's very compelling evidence. If we follow this line to today, it's about 1.0 degrees total warming. So I move on to my next point, something more relevant to today. Back in October, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a special report on global warming to talk to policymakers about, well, to convince them that it's a pretty big deal. And the report isn't that hard to understand. It's actually a rather simple reasoning. The main idea is that by around 2050, as shown by this image here, we're projected to be somewhere around 1.5 degrees total warming. And if we don't do anything, by 2100, we're going to be around 2.0 degrees Celsius total warming. And the IPCC wants us to basically change our emission policies so that we can somehow level out around 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the reason why it's such a big distinction between the two, really it's the whole bulk of the report. They talk about the consequences of both outcomes and compare the two. You know, I'm not going to get into the details of what they talk about, but for instance, you know, they might say, okay, so at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we predict that the sea level will rise this much, and at 2 degrees Celsius, it'll rise this much. And really, the whole point of the thing is that it is astronomically worse at 2 degrees Celsius than it is at 1.5. And really, it's kind of 1.5 is the best we can do with. There's still bad effects there, but it's much less worse than 2.0 degrees Celsius. But anyhow, on to the main argument. I'd like to talk about a different way to process this sort of information when science tries to predict the future. And to start off, I want to acknowledge the fact that a lot of people, including our president, for instance, he's very into this, denounces science and calls global warming a hoax entirely. And I'm going to say, it might surprise you, I don't think that this is really a good way to process science, but I don't think it's ridiculous to think that global warming is a hoax. And that's kind of weird. A lot of people think that it isn't a hoax. But now, I'd like to kind of explain my reasoning by citing an example from a book we read in my philosophy of science class entitled Getting Science Wrong by Paul Dickman. And in this example, it talks about a man named William Stanley Jevons, pictured there. He was an economist in the United Kingdom, and back in 1865, he wrote a book called The Coal Question. Now, he basically claimed in this book, it was a lot of calculations and logical claims, and he said, hey, the United Kingdom is using way too much coal, and in fact, according to his calculations, he predicted that they would use over 100 billion tons of coal by the turn of the 20th century, which is more than exists on the Earth. And here we are in 2019, and we have actually a rather large amount of coal left, so obviously he went wrong somewhere. So, and this is the kind of weird part where you got to start trying to think outside the box. where did he go wrong in predicting the future and talking about those things? Well, the reason is that he's trying to do the same thing that a fortune teller tries to do. And this might be a little hard to accept or think about, but the truth is that science has no real way to predict the future to any degree of certainty. There are simply too many variables that are impossible to account for. We can say, okay, at the rates today, if everything remains the same, this will happen. And okay, I suppose that makes sense. But in society, sometimes we view science as this sort of authority, this unquestionable authority that tells us what to think about reality or how to think about policy and changing it. And the truth is, it really cannot do that. It cannot predict the future until we research time travel. So in that way, I don't think that it's a good idea to just 100% agree with what science is telling us. But yet, I also don't think it's a good idea to denounce science as a hoax. And why I think that is because if we go back to Jevons for a second, all of his calculations were 100% correct. The reason why he was wrong in reality is because of technological advancement and the fact that we found substitutes, really. The fact that they could use less coal and get the same output, and the fact that they use other fuels like petroleum, for instance, made his numbers astronomically wrong. In fact, they only used 2 billion tons of coal versus his 100 billion, so he kind of looks a little bit like an idiot, I guess, in the historical scale. But this compares rather nicely to global warming today, because it allows me to talk about how I think we should think about it. If we go to Jevons' case, he was perfectly correct, and if we wouldn't have met that sort of technological burden, and we would have just kind of kept using coal at the same rate, we might be living in a world without coal. And hopefully you can see the connection between this and global warming today. We're trying to predict something about the future, and we have no idea what kind of technological advancement they're going to be, or what kind of, we have no idea what's going to happen. There's too many outliers or things that could happen, and where does this put us? You know, it's kind of confusing to think about. Okay, I'm saying, well, we shouldn't trust science 100%, we shouldn't call it a hoax. Where are we? Well, the answer is, I respect the fact that the IPCC is a valid source of knowledge, and a lot of trend data is very useful, but I also respect the fact that they can't actually really predict the future at all. There's so many things that could happen. So the way I think about it is there are a system of possibilities, an infinite system of possibilities when you think about it. There is a chance indeed where we don't do anything in policy, and somehow we are miraculously saved by some sort of technological revolution, or perhaps scientists are just wrong about global warming. That possibility exists when we admit that we don't really know what the future holds. But also the possibility exists that global warming scientists are 100% correct, and we're going to be in a very bad place in 2100 if we don't do anything. So in this way, when we can admit that we really don't know what the future holds, I would like to imply that perhaps we are asking the wrong question about global warming. And if science is right or wrong, well, we just end up arguing, and there becomes so much turmoil. But if we ask, and we admit to ourselves that we don't know what the future holds, what if we ask, what happens if the possibility occurs where they are right, and where the Earth is going to be in a sort of doomsday situation by 2100? Certainly, if we had some way of knowing if they were right, we would do everything possible we could to change now so it doesn't happen, but we don't know that. And that's really the main point of my argument. That's why it's a good idea to push for policy change, because it is scary that we don't know what's going to happen. But on the grounds that there is a possibility indeed that they are correct, that's why we should push for it, just to make sure to try to lessen the odds that that happens. So, to conclude, when we can acknowledge the fact that we really cannot predict the future, it brings us to a sort of unique situation where we can examine all the possibilities together that could happen. And there are as equal good opportunities as there are bad opportunities. So at the end of the day, if we don't change the policy, we're effectively gambling with the fate of the Earth, right? We're betting, going all in on a hand of blackjack, you know? But we have this very, very unique opportunity to shift the odds in our favor, right? By doing policy change, by extending the time we have left on the Earth before it gets into a doomsday situation, or perhaps extending the time we have left to do some sort of technological advancement to pull us out of this hole. And when you put it that way, and when you think about it in this very unique way, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't push forward policy change.